Alpha King Varric Blackmore had survived 3 assassination attempts. He had negotiated peace treaties, defeated rival Alphas, and once stared down an entire council of angry nobles without blinking. Yet somehow, a maid carrying tea would prove far more dangerous. The royal council chamber buzzed with discussion. Trade reports covered the long oak table. Ministers debated shipping routes. Generals argued about border security. Advisors exchanged increasingly complicated opinions that nobody seemed to enjoy. Varric sat at the head of the table, pretending to listen. Mostly, his attention wandered occasionally. Not because the meeting lacked importance, because someone entered carrying a silver tea tray. Juniper Holloway, the palace maid, moved gracefully between council members, refilling cups and replacing empty teapots. A perfectly ordinary task, one she performed nearly every day. Yet Varric noticed immediately. He always did. The realization irritated him. There were hundreds of servants in the palace. Hundreds. So why was Juniper the only one he could identify from across a crowded room? The question remained unanswered. As usual, Juniper smiled politely as she served tea to the ministers. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a servant's cap. A few loose strands escaped near her temples. For reasons Varric refused to examine, he noticed those too, unfortunately. An older servant, helping nearby, paused beside her. "You seem cheerful today." Juniper laughed. The sound carried surprisingly far through the chamber. "Do I?" "You do." The older woman smiled knowingly. "What's the occasion?" Juniper adjusted the teapot in her hands, then answered casually, "I have a date tonight." Crash. The sound exploded through the council chamber. Conversation stopped instantly. Every head turned. Several ministers nearly jumped from their chairs. A shattered crystal goblet lay beside the Alpha King's seat. Wine spread slowly across the polished floor. Silence followed. Heavy, confused, complete. Varric stared at the broken glass. The broken glass stared back. For several long seconds, neither seemed willing to explain what happened. Finally, the king's advisor cleared his throat. "Your Majesty." Varric looked up, calmly, far too calmly. It slipped. No one believed him. Not even slightly. Crystal goblets didn't usually shatter because people were sitting still. Yet nobody was brave enough to argue. Across the room, Juniper looked concerned. "Are you hurt, Your Majesty?" The question somehow made everything worse, because she sounded genuinely worried. Not embarrassed, not suspicious, just kind. Varric forced himself to nod. I'm fine." Juniper smiled in relief, then returned to serving tea as though nothing unusual had happened. The meeting slowly resumed, at least for everyone else, because Varric's wolf had become impossible to ignore. The creature paced restlessly inside his mind, agitated, protective, possessive, and far too pleased with itself. Finally, it offered the explanation Varric desperately didn't want. "Mate." The single word echoed through his thoughts, and suddenly, the shattered goblet made perfect sense. The problem wasn't that Juniper Holloway had a date. The problem was that Juniper Holloway had absolutely no idea the Alpha King was obsessed with her. Not that Varric would have used that word. Obsessed sounded unhealthy, ridiculous, slightly alarming. He preferred observant. Unfortunately, nobody else agreed, especially his advisor. Looking back, the signs had been obvious, painfully obvious. For nearly 2 years, Varric found increasingly creative reasons to appear wherever Juniper happened to be working. If Juniper was assigned to the East Gardens, suddenly the Alpha King developed a passionate interest in landscaping. If she assisted during charity events, he attended personally. If she worked morning shifts, breakfast meetings mysteriously became more common. His advisor noticed. The palace guards noticed. Several ministers noticed. Even the kitchen staff noticed. The only person who didn't notice was Juniper herself. To her, the Alpha King was simply her employer, a distant royal figure, important, respectable, completely outside her world. Meanwhile, Varric could identify her footsteps in a crowded hallway. The situation was becoming embarrassing, especially now, because Juniper's date had become the most discussed topic among palace servants, and unfortunately, Varric possessed excellent hearing. He discovered this while walking through a corridor he normally never used. Coincidentally, entirely coincidentally, his name is Ethan. Juniper's cheerful voice drifted from an open doorway. Varric stopped walking. Purely by accident. A servant laughed. The merchant. Juniper nodded. So that's why you've been smiling. Maybe. The answer carried obvious happiness. Varric frowned. Inside his head, his wolf growled. Merchant. The word sounded offensive now. The conversation continued, apparently determined to ruin his afternoon. I heard he's handsome. Juniper laughed. That's what everyone keeps saying. Varric's jaw tightened. Handsome. Wonderful. Exactly what he wanted to hear. A few minutes later, he accidentally passed the same hallway again, entirely by coincidence. This time, the conversation had somehow become worse. He brought flowers. Flowers. The merchant brought flowers. Varric stared at a nearby wall. The wall wisely remained silent. His wolf looked ready to declare war. Later that afternoon, a minister arrived to discuss trade negotiations. The meeting lasted approximately 4 minutes before the royal desk developed a new crack. Nobody mentioned it. By sunset, half the palace had noticed something unusual. The Alpha King was in a terrible mood. Servants moved carefully around him. Council members shortened meetings. Even the guards spoke more quietly. The atmosphere felt tense, dangerous, all because a maid was preparing for dinner. Meanwhile, Juniper remained blissfully unaware. She finished her duties, changed into a simple blue dress, and left the palace looking happier than Varric had ever seen her. The sight should not have bothered him. It bothered him immensely. From his office window, he watched her disappear through the palace gates, excitement brightening every step. For reasons he absolutely refused to analyze, the image settled heavily in his chest. His wolf paced restlessly. The merchant was waiting. The date was beginning. And for the first time in years, Alpha King Varric Blackmore found himself irrationally jealous of a man he had never met. Ethan Mercer had planned a very simple evening. Arrive on time, bring flowers, take Juniper to dinner, try not to embarrass himself. Unfortunately, fate appeared determined to sabotage those plans. Or perhaps not fate. His problems began the moment he left his shop. The carriage he hired developed a broken wheel less than 3 streets from the restaurant. An inconvenience, nothing more. At least initially. Ethan paid for repairs and continued on foot. Then a city guard stopped him. Apparently, a delivery wagon overturned ahead, blocking the fastest route. He received alternate directions. Unfortunately, the directions were wrong. Spectacularly wrong. 30 minutes later, Ethan found himself standing beside a warehouse district he had never seen before. The evening continued deteriorating from there. A sudden rainstorm appeared. A bridge closed unexpectedly for maintenance. A street performer accidentally released 3 goats into a crowded market. The goats caused chaos. The chaos caused delays. The delays caused despair. By the time Ethan finally reached the restaurant, the reservation had been canceled. The kitchen had closed, and Juniper was long gone. Meanwhile, several miles away, Alpha King Varric Blackmore sat inside his office, pretending to focus on paperwork. Pretending very badly. His advisor stood across the room, arms folded, expression exhausted. The older man had spent 20 years serving the crown. Never once had he questioned his career choices. Until now, Your Majesty. Varric continued reading a document upside down. Yes? The advisor inhaled deeply, the way people do before making dangerous decisions. Did you sabotage a merchant? Silence. Varric slowly lowered the paper. What? The advisor stared. The king stared back. Neither appeared impressed. Finally, the advisor clarified. The merchant taking Miss Holloway to dinner. A pause. Did you sabotage him? Varric looked genuinely offended. No. The answer arrived immediately. Too immediately. The advisor narrowed his eyes. Years of experience taught him exactly what that tone meant. Then Varric added the worst possible follow-up. Not directly. The advisor closed his eyes. Briefly, because that answer explained far too much. Your Majesty. Varric looked away, suddenly fascinated by a nearby bookshelf. The reaction was not encouraging. The advisor continued. Did you order the city guards to redirect traffic? No. A pause. Technically. The advisor pinched the bridge of his nose. Technically? I merely approved a request earlier this week. Silence. The advisor waited. Varric reluctantly continued. The road closure may have affected his route. May have? Another pause. The bridge maintenance schedule was adjusted. The room became very quiet. The advisor stared at the ceiling, possibly searching for patience, possibly searching for divine intervention. Neither appeared available. Across the city, Ethan finally surrendered. Instead of dinner, he purchased fresh stationery, then spent half the night writing an apology letter, a sincere one, explaining the disasters, the delays, the unbelievable sequence of events that prevented him from arriving. The next morning, Juniper received the letter. She read it twice, then sighed softly, not devastated, not heartbroken, just disappointed. The date never happened. The merchant never arrived. And somewhere inside the palace, an Alpha King felt entirely too relieved about a situation he absolutely should have felt guilty about. Juniper handled disappointment better than most people. When Ethan's apology letter arrived, she read it carefully, twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into her apron pocket. The explanation sounded sincere. Unfortunately, sincerity didn't change the outcome. Dinner never happened. The flowers never arrived. The evening she'd spent looking forward to all week simply disappeared. Still, she refused to complain. Life contained larger problems than one missed date. By the following morning, she returned to work as usual. Polite, professional, slightly disappointed, but otherwise unchanged. The same could not be said for Alpha King Varric Blackmore, because while Juniper recovered quickly, Varric spent the entire morning battling an uncomfortable emotion. Relief, followed immediately by guilt. Then, relief again. The cycle became exhausting. By midday, a visiting duchess arrived for a scheduled meeting. Duchess Helena Thornfield possessed many talents: diplomacy, political strategy, negotiation. Unfortunately for Varric, she also possessed exceptional observational skills. The meeting proceeded normally at first. Trade discussions, regional concerns, agricultural reports. Everything remained perfectly professional until Juniper entered carrying refreshments. The Duchess noticed her immediately. Not because Juniper behaved strangely, because Varric did. The Alpha King's attention followed the maid the moment she entered, tracked her movement across the room, lingered as she poured tea, then remained fixed on her several seconds after she left. The behavior lasted perhaps half a minute, more than enough. The Duchess slowly looked toward the closed door, then toward Varric, then toward the door again. A smile appeared, the kind that usually meant trouble. What? Varric asked suspiciously. The Duchess ignored him. Instead, she turned toward the royal advisor. Does she know? The advisor nearly choked on his tea. Across the room, two servants suddenly became fascinated by absolutely nothing. Varric frowned. Know what? The Duchess blinked, then laughed. A long laugh. A genuine laugh. The kind people reserve for situations so obvious they become absurd. Varric's confusion deepened. Eventually, the Duchess wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Oh, this is wonderful. The Alpha King looked offended. What is? She pointed toward the door Juniper had used moments earlier. That. Silence. Varric stared blankly. The Duchess stared back. Finally, realization dawned. Not on him, on her. You don't know. The statement sounded almost delighted. I don't know what? The Duchess laughed again. The advisor quietly covered his face, because he already knew exactly where this conversation was heading, and there was no stopping it now. Helena leaned back in her chair, studying the Alpha King with open amusement, then delivered the sentence that silenced the room. Your Majesty, you're hopelessly in love with that maid. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the servants froze, because everyone present had secretly reached the same conclusion months ago. Everyone except Varric. The Alpha King stared. The Duchess smiled. The advisor sighed. And suddenly, 2 years of suspicious behavior replayed through Varric's mind. The garden visits, the altered schedules, the unnecessary hallway inspections, the jealousy, the merchant, the shattered goblet, one memory after another, each one worse than the last. For the first time, Varric found himself facing a possibility he could no longer dismiss, and judging by the amused expression on the Duchess's face, everyone else had figured it out long before he did. For 3 days, Alpha King Varric Blackmore avoided Juniper Holloway. Not intentionally. At least, that was the excuse he gave himself. The reality was far less flattering. He was embarrassed. Deeply. Painfully. Embarrassingly embarrassed. Because once Duchess Helena pointed it out, he couldn't stop noticing it. Every suspicious coincidence. Every unnecessary detour. Every ridiculous attempt to cross paths with a maid who remained completely unaware. The worst part? The Duchess had been right. Hopelessly right. By the 4th day, avoidance became impossible. His wolf had grown increasingly impatient. His advisor had grown increasingly annoyed. And Varric had grown increasingly tired of pretending. Something had to change, preferably before he accidentally redirected another merchant. The opportunity arrived that afternoon. Juniper was arranging fresh flowers in one of the palace sitting rooms. A simple task. Peaceful. Ordinary. Unfortunately, the moment Varric entered, half the palace somehow became aware of it. Servants lingered nearby. Guards suddenly volunteered for hallway duty. Even the royal advisor appeared suspiciously interested in a bookshelf outside the door. The entire palace was spying. Poorly. Juniper looked up as Varric approached, then smiled politely. Your Majesty. The greeting immediately complicated his ability to form coherent sentences, a problem he found increasingly frustrating. For several moments, silence stretched between them. Juniper waited patiently. The Alpha King, meanwhile, forgot the speech he had rehearsed 17 times. Eventually, he managed. I wanted to ask you something. Juniper nodded. Of course. Outside the room, 3 servants nearly collided while attempting to eavesdrop discreetly. They failed. Varric took a breath. Then another. Conquering rival alphas had been easier than this. Finally, he spoke. Would you have dinner with me? Silence. Absolute silence. Even the hallway seemed to stop breathing. Juniper blinked. Once. Twice. Clearly surprised. Varric immediately wanted to retract the question and flee the kingdom. Unfortunately, kings weren't allowed to do that. So he waited. The answer felt inevitable. He was the Alpha King. Most people would have accepted before he finished asking, which made what happened next significantly worse. Juniper smiled politely, then shook her head. No. The word hit him harder than any battle wound. For several seconds, he simply stared, certain he had misunderstood. What? Juniper's expression remained kind, patient, unimpressed by titles, unimpressed by crowns, unimpressed by power. It was one of the things he liked most about her. At that moment, however, it felt slightly inconvenient. You heard me? Varric blinked again. Because nobody rejected the Alpha King. At least not directly. Most people invented excuses, scheduling conflicts, prior commitments, mysterious illnesses. Juniper simply said no. The straightforward honesty left him completely unprepared. Around them, the palace held its collective breath, waiting, watching, trying not to look interested, failing spectacularly. Finally, Varric managed. May I ask why? Juniper's smile widened slightly. The answer arrived immediately. Simple, reasonable, impossible to argue with. You already ruined one date. The room went silent, and for perhaps the first time in his reign, Alpha King Varric Blackmore looked genuinely embarrassed. For several seconds, Varric simply stared at Juniper. Not because her reasoning was unfair, because it was completely fair, painfully fair. The silence stretched between them. Outside the room, someone accidentally bumped into a suit of armor. The loud clang echoed through the hallway. Neither Varric nor Juniper reacted. Both knew the palace was listening. The servants knew they knew. Everyone silently agreed to ignore it. Finally, Varric exhaled. That's a valid point. Juniper looked mildly surprised. Apparently she expected an argument, or perhaps a royal decree. Instead, the Alpha King nodded, slowly, reluctantly, accepting the criticism. I handled that badly. The admission felt strange. Kings weren't famous for apologizing, especially not to maids. Juniper studied him carefully, as though deciding whether he actually meant it. Then, she asked the question he dreaded. Did you have something to do with it? Varric considered lying. The idea survived approximately 3 seconds. His wolf immediately rejected it. And honestly, so did he. Indirectly, Juniper groaned. The sound contained enough disappointment to make him wince. Your Majesty, I know. No, I don't think you do. The answer landed harder than expected. Because she wasn't angry, just disappointed, and somehow that felt worse. Varric rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture his advisor would later describe as historic. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Juniper crossed her arms. Then what were you trying to do? The question trapped him, because there wasn't a good answer, only an honest one. After a long pause, he spoke. I didn't want you going. Silence. The confession hung heavily between them. Juniper blinked, once, twice, then stared. Not because she was flattered, because she genuinely couldn't believe what she was hearing. You sabotaged a man's evening because you were jealous. When she phrased it that way, it sounded significantly worse. Unfortunately, it was also accurate. Varric closed his eyes briefly. Yes, the honesty surprised both of them. For the first time, Juniper saw something she rarely associated with the Alpha King. Embarrassment. Real embarrassment. Not political frustration, not royal irritation. Embarrassment. The sight softened her expression slightly. Only slightly. You can't do that. I know. You can't interfere in people's lives because you're unhappy. I know. Another pause. The repeated agreements seemed to throw her off balance. Eventually, Juniper sighed. The tension in her shoulders eased. Not gone. Just reduced. Titles don't impress me. Varric nodded. I've noticed. Power doesn't impress me either. Also noticed. Her lips twitched despite herself. The reaction encouraged him. dangerously. What does impress you? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Juniper considered the answer carefully, then said, trust. The word struck deeper than expected, because trust was exactly what he damaged. Not just with Ethan, with her. The realization settled heavily between them. Finally, Varric straightened. I owe you an apology. You do. I'm sorry. The words were simple, unpolished, completely sincere. Juniper studied him for several moments, then nodded once. Acceptance. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just acceptance. As she turned to leave, Varric spoke again. Is there any chance we can start over? Juniper paused at the doorway, thinking, evaluating. Then she looked back. Friendship. The single word carried conditions, boundaries, possibilities. Nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time in months, the Alpha King realized earning her trust might take far longer than losing it. Alpha King Varric Blackmore discovered something surprising. Winning a kingdom was easier than earning Juniper Holloway's trust. Kingdoms responded to armies, treaties, authority. Juniper responded to none of those things, which left him with only one option: patience. The realization nearly killed him. The first month proved especially difficult. Every instinct urged him to move faster, to impress her, to solve problems, to accelerate the process. Juniper rejected every shortcut. If he brought expensive gifts, she politely returned them. If he attempted special treatment, she refused it. If he used his title to smooth obstacles, she immediately noticed and disapproved. Eventually, Varric stopped trying. Not because he gave up, because he finally understood. Juniper wasn't interested in the Alpha King. She wanted to know the man beneath the crown. Unfortunately, that required him to actually show up. The process felt alarmingly unfamiliar. Friendship began with small conversations, ordinary conversations, the kind Varric rarely experienced. Juniper asked questions nobody else asked. What books did he enjoy? Which responsibility did he hate most? What did he want before becoming king? The answers surprised both of them, especially him, because nobody usually cared. People asked what a king could provide. Juniper asked who he was. Meanwhile, the palace watched everything. With enthusiasm, servants became experts at accidental eavesdropping. Guards developed remarkable hearing. The royal advisor eventually started placing wagers on how long the friendship stage would last. The entire palace had chosen sides. Varric found this deeply inappropriate, then secretly asked for updates. Several months passed. Slowly, the friendship became real. Not forced, not awkward, comfortable. Juniper laughed more easily around him now, teased him occasionally, corrected him frequently. The corrections happened far more often than he preferred. One afternoon, she discovered him reviewing reports during lunch. Again, you skipped breakfast. Varric looked up. How she knew remained a mystery. I was busy. You were stubborn. Those are different things. They really aren't. The conversation somehow ended with him eating lunch. Juniper considered this a victory. Varric suspected she was right. The strange part was how much he enjoyed these moments. Not the arguments, the honesty. No one else spoke to him this way. No one else treated him like a normal person. The experience became addictive, which worried him slightly. Then came the day everything shifted. Not dramatically, not romantically, simply. Juniper entered the library, carrying a stack of books. She spotted him immediately. For once, there were no duties requiring her presence, no official reason to stay. Yet she walked toward him anyway. Varric noticed instantly. His wolf noticed too, though thankfully it remained quiet, mostly. Juniper set the books down on a nearby table, then hesitated. A rare occurrence. You mentioned that historical festival in Rivermark. Varric nodded. I did. Another pause. Then Juniper smiled. A little nervous, a little hopeful. Would you like to go? The question stunned him. Not because of what it meant, because she asked. Voluntarily. No obligations, no royal duties, no excuses. Just a simple invitation. And, for the first time since they met, Juniper wasn't spending time with him because circumstances required it. She wanted to. The Rivermark Festival changed everything. Not immediately, not dramatically, but unmistakably. For the first time, Varric and Juniper spent an entire day together, without palace walls, royal duties, or curious servants hovering nearby. The experience felt strangely normal and wonderfully dangerous. The festival stretched across the Riverside district. Musicians performed on every corner. Merchants filled colorful market stalls. Children raced through crowded streets, carrying ribbons and sweets. For one afternoon, the Alpha King managed to disappear into the crowd. Juniper found that deeply amusing. You seem excited. Varric frowned. I'm not excited. You bought 3 pastries. That proves nothing. Juniper laughed. The sound immediately improved his mood, which annoyed him slightly. Over the following months, their friendship deepened, naturally. The palace noticed. Of course. The servants became unbearable. Every shared smile generated rumors. Every conversation inspired theories. The royal advisor eventually demanded hazard pay. No one took him seriously. Meanwhile, Juniper continued challenging Varric in ways nobody else dared. If he became stubborn, she said so. If he worked too much, she pointed it out. If he made poor decisions, she informed him immediately. The strange part was that he listened. Not always, but more often than anyone expected, including himself. One evening, they stood together on a palace balcony overlooking the city. Lights glowed across distant streets. The night air felt cool and peaceful. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now, familiar. Juniper leaned against the railing. You've changed. Varric glanced sideways. Is that a compliment? Mostly. The answer earned a laugh. Then her expression softened. Thoughtful. I think you stopped trying to impress me. The observation surprised him. Because it was true. At some point, he stopped focusing on winning her affection. Stopped searching for shortcuts. Stopped trying to control outcomes. Instead, he simply enjoyed being around her. The realization felt oddly significant. Maybe. Juniper smiled. Definitely. The city lights reflected in her eyes. For a moment, Varric forgot every carefully prepared speech he'd ever imagined. His wolf remained unusually quiet. Not because the bond weakened, because it no longer needed to push. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Slowly, honestly, by choice. Juniper turned toward him fully. The movement drew his attention immediately. Her expression carried a vulnerability he rarely saw. For once, she seemed nervous. The sight made his pulse quicken. Can I tell you something? Varric nodded. Anything. She hesitated, then laughed softly, almost at herself. When I first met you, I only saw a king. Silence settled between them. Juniper looked toward the city again, searching for the right words. Eventually, she found them. I don't anymore. The confession hit harder than any declaration of love, because he understood exactly what she meant. She no longer saw the crown first, or the title, or the power. She saw him, the man beneath all of it. And somehow, after months of patience, mistakes, apologies, friendship and trust, that meant more than anything else. Years later, the story became palace legend. New servants heard it during their first week of employment. Guards repeated it during night shifts. Kitchen staff told increasingly dramatic versions whenever they needed entertainment. Each retelling became more ridiculous. According to one version, the Alpha King shattered 6 crystal goblets. Another claimed he declared war on a merchant caravan. A third insisted he personally chased Ethan Mercer through the city. None of those stories were true. Mostly, the real story was embarrassing enough. Juniper made certain nobody forgot it, especially Varric. "Remember the goblet?" Juniper asked one evening. The Alpha King groaned immediately. The reaction delighted her. 5 years of marriage had only encouraged this behavior. "You mention that entirely too often." "Because it was funny." "It wasn't funny. It was extremely funny." Their daughter, seated nearby with a picture book, looked up curiously. "What goblet?" Varric immediately pointed toward Juniper. "Your mother enjoys spreading misinformation." Juniper laughed. The sound filled the royal sitting room. Warm, comfortable, home. The years had changed many things. The palace no longer felt quite so intimidating. The Alpha King smiled more, worked less, at least according to Juniper. He disagreed strongly. She ignored him. Some traditions never changed. Across the room, the royal advisor entered carrying documents. He stopped immediately, sighed, then turned around. "Wrong room." "No," Varric replied. "You're already here." The older wolf looked deeply disappointed. "I was hoping to avoid whatever this conversation is." "You can't." Juniper grinned. "We're discussing the date." The advisor closed his eyes. "Not again." Unfortunately for him, nobody listened. 5 minutes later, he was reluctantly helping tell the story, including the carriage problems, the road closures, and the infamous merchant incident. By the end, even their daughter was laughing, particularly at the part where the Alpha King believed no one noticed his behavior. "They all knew," she giggled. The advisor nodded. "Everyone." Juniper smiled. "Everyone except your father." Varric accepted the humiliation with as much dignity as possible, which wasn't much. Eventually, the laughter faded. The conversation shifted. Their daughter returned to her book. The advisor escaped with his reports, and silence settled comfortably over the room. Juniper moved closer, resting her head against Varric's shoulder. The gesture felt familiar, effortless. 1,000 ordinary moments, creating something extraordinary. After a while, she spoke quietly. "You know what the funny part is?" Varric glanced down. "What?" Her smile softened. "You were never actually angry about Ethan." The observation surprised him, then didn't, because she was right. Years earlier, he thought jealousy was the problem. Now he understood better. "No." Juniper intertwined her fingers with his. "You were scared." The truth settled between them. Simple, accurate, undeniable. He hadn't feared the merchant. He feared losing the chance to tell someone how much they mattered. And in the end, that became the lesson remembered long after the laughter faded. Sometimes the strongest people aren't frightened by losing battles. They're frightened by realizing someone else might win a heart they should have fought for sooner.